Welcome to our walk through the book of Exodus as we're going through the Old Testament in our walk through the Bible. When you read Exodus, you encounter God, and we also encounter the Son of God. In other words, Exodus reveals to us the Lord Jesus Christ. This is his story as much as it's the Father's story. Now again, we need to remember why this record is in the Bible. It's there so that we can learn, because God teaches by example and by metaphor. Exodus is God's teaching manual for salvation. First for Israel coming out of Egypt, and secondly for the Christians being redeemed from the slavery to sin. Exodus is God's teaching manual on salvation. First for Israel coming out of Egypt, and secondly for Christians being redeemed from the slavery to sin. The first is there to set up a teaching model so we will understand the second. In Luke chapter 24 and verse 44 clearly shows the Christology of Exodus. Exodus is the gospel of the Old Testament, for its connection to Jesus is very, very real. Jude in his epistle actually says it was Jesus who delivered the Israelites from Egypt. You have that in Jude verse 3. Now I want to remind you, although you once fully knew it, that Jesus, who saved a people out of the land of Egypt. You know, in many ways, Exodus models the life of Jesus. For example, like Moses, Jesus was born to be a savior and was rescued from his enemies at birth. You remember Mary and Joseph fled to Egypt to escape from King Herod. And he too went into Egypt to fulfill the model of the Exodus. For it is written, he too would go into Egypt and come out. As Hosea wrote, out of Egypt I called my son. Hosea chapter 11 and verse 1 and Matthew chapter 2 and verse 15. And like the children of Israel, Jesus passed through the waters of baptism. With Israel, it was in the Red Sea, but with Jesus by John the Baptist in the Jordan River. Also, like the Israelites who wandered in the desert for 40 years, Jesus went out into the wilderness for 40 days to endure the temptations of the evil one. And when he returned from the wilderness, we have the moral law that he gave, which we call the Sermon on the Mount. You read it in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. And it parallels Moses, who brought the law of God down from Mount Sinai. And when we study the death of Christ, we find it follows many patterns set out in the Exodus. Consider the transfiguration as recorded in Matthew 17 when Jesus was praying. It says his appearance changed to brilliant light, and two men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor talking with Jesus. And they spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment in Jerusalem. That's in Luke chapter 9 and verse 30-31. Now, it is significant that Moses was present, because the word Luke uses for Jesus' departure is the Greek word for Exodus. So Moses and Elijah were talking about our Lord's Exodus, which took place through his crucifixion and resurrection. And again, Jesus was crucified on the very day that Israel celebrated the feast that is called the Passover. As Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7, Jesus, our Passover lamb. You see, it is the Passover that explains how Jesus' death will enable those enslaved to sin experience their exodus. Jesus is the Passover lamb who takes away the sins of the world, as we find in John's Gospel chapter 1 and verse 29. So all that Israel experienced models what every born-again Christian has experienced through Jesus, through their exodus. And all these connections with Christ show that Exodus is not just a story of salvation, but the story of salvation. Israel's deliverance from Egypt anticipated the salvation accomplished once and for all in Jesus Christ. As Philip Rankin has written in his commentary on Exodus, and I quote, "We too needed a deliverer, a God to save us from slavery and destroy our enemy. We needed a provider, a God to feed us bread from heaven and water from the rock. And we too needed a lawgiver, a God with commandments for us that would show us how to love and to serve Him. And we too needed a friend, a God to stay with us day and night forever." End of quote. So with all that in front of us, where do we start with the book of Exodus? Well, let's start with outlining it and its contents. We have 40 chapters in the book, but they can be broken down into topics. And in this lecture, let's go through the first 12 chapters of Exodus. Chapter 1 sets the scene. Joseph, at the end of Genesis chapter 50, brings his whole family to Egypt. And they're honoured and respected until, as it says, there was a Pharaoh or a king that did not know Joseph. That's Exodus 1 and 8. You see, this Pharaoh realised that if Egypt were attacked and the Hebrews, who had grown to such a huge number, sided with the attacking army, well, Egypt would fall. So he created what we call forced labour, basic slavery, to control these refugees. A huge building program was established, and the Hebrews were forced labour. But none of this slowed the growth of the nation of Israel. So Pharaoh then decreed that all the midwives had to commit infanticide, or by murdering the Hebrew child when he was born. Now this is where we are introduced to Moses in chapter 2. You see, his mother and father, Amram and Jochebed, were not going to comply with Pharaoh's demands. So what they did was they hid their newborn son in a basket, a floating basket made of reeds in the Nile River. And they placed Miriam, the little child's sister, to keep watch from a safe distance. Now we know the story. Pharaoh's daughter came and discovered the basket, discovered the child, and ended up, at the suggestion of Miriam, to allow the child's mother, Jochebed, to be the nurse for the child, whom she called Moses, until he was old enough to come into the palace, where he would be adopted as her son. Well, when that happened and years went by, Moses was now 40 years of age, and he developed over that time an empathy with the Hebrew slaves. And even in an attempt to correct the injustice they experienced, Moses ended up killing an Egyptian soldier, knowing that if this were discovered, Pharaoh would have killed him. So he flees to the Midian desert, and he ends up meeting with a family, and he ends up marrying one of the daughters of that family. And the girl's name was Zipporah. And for the next 40 years of Moses' life, Moses became a shepherd minding his father-in-law's sheep. Well, it's in chapter 3 where the story really begins. For Moses sees a bush aflame without being consumed, and his curiosity takes him closer. And from the bush, God reveals himself to Moses as the great I Am, the eternal existent one. And he commissions Moses to return to Egypt to bring the Hebrew people out. Then in chapter 4, we find God equips Moses with miraculous signs to convince both his people and Pharaoh to let the Hebrews go. Well, the shepherd's staff that Moses carried in his daily occupation was thrown to the ground, and it became a snake. And then Moses was told to put his hand and pick it up. I don't know how he felt about that. And then another miracle was that Moses was told to put his hand inside his cloak. And when he brought it out, his hand was leprous, which is a skin disease that would eat away at the body. He was then told to return his hand into the cloak and to bring it out again. And this time, everything was restored to a healthy hand. And there was a third sign that was promised, and that is he was to take some of the water from the Nile River back in Egypt, and he was to pour it out onto the ground in front of people, and it would become blood. At this commissioning, Moses begins to make excuses, complaining that he can't really speak, and he's certainly not eloquent. So God graciously accommodates his fears and promises that his brother Aaron could speak on his behalf. And the chapter ends with Moses returning to Egypt. Now in chapter 5, Moses is before Pharaoh, who rejects the request to allow the people to go into the wilderness to worship God. And he actually increases the workload, believing that if they had time to waste in worship, they needed more work to occupy their time. And of course, this brings a significant backlash and a rejection against Moses and Aaron by the Hebrew community. In chapter 6, God's promises are laid out in verses 6 and 7. And we will come back to these verses when we look at what is known as the Passover meal later in our lecture. This chapter also gives us the family tree of Moses, for he came from the lineage of Levi. And now in chapter 7, the contest begins between Moses and Pharaoh's magicians. You see, Moses throws his staff down and it becomes a snake. But Pharaoh's magicians do likewise. But there is a difference, and a very significant one. Moses' snake swallows up the magician's snakes, and then he picks up the staff, or the snake I should say, and it becomes a wooden staff again. And it's in chapter 7 that we find the first of the 10 plagues, because God had told Moses that he was going to bring judgment upon the land of Egypt. For this first plague, it occurred when Pharaoh was having his morning swim in the Nile River, when Moses tells him that he's about to strike the water with his staff and that the river would turn to blood, which will kill the fish, create a huge stink, and make the water undrinkable. And not only did this happen to the Nile River, but it happened to the surrounding contributaries to the Nile, as well as the pools and the drinking pots within Egypt. Now there is an interesting phenomena here, because Pharaoh's magicians were able to repeat the same miracle in some way that convinced Pharaoh that there was nothing significant about this sign. Again, Pharaoh hardens his heart and refuses to let the people go. In chapter 8, we have the second plague, which is a plague of frogs, followed by the third plague, which is gnats, and the fourth, a plague of flies. Now, it's interesting when you study ancient civilization, you will often find that creatures that are not controllable would often be deified. So the frogs and the gnats and the flies in Egypt became gods. But what was happening here was that the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and Moses had complete control over all the so-called Egyptian gods. He alone could bring them in plague proportion and could remove them at his will. With the frogs, the magicians were able to draw frogs out of the Nile River, which could indicate that the plague frogs were miraculously created for this purpose and were not the frogs that lived in the Nile River. Now we know that Pharaoh pleaded with Moses to remove the frogs, and he promised to allow the people to go and worship God if he did. But after the frogs were removed, he hardened his heart again and he refused. Which takes us into chapter 9. And there is a record of the fifth plague, a plague that killed much of the livestock in Egypt, cattle and goats and sheep and horses and donkeys and camels. But interestingly, none of the Hebrew stock fell afoul to this plague. And the sixth plague affected the people and the remaining stock within the land. It was boils. And the passage points out that these boils impacted the magicians in Pharaoh's court. The seventh plague was hail. Now, one wonders how often hail fell in this area of the Middle East. On this occasion, it was obvious that the impact of the plague at the command of Moses were divided, for it was the Egyptian community that alone suffered from this. Now, again, it's also worth noting that because some were told of the coming plague, they brought all their stock under shelter to make sure that they didn't suffer loss, while others that didn't believe what Moses had said lost their remaining stock. It's obvious that much of the stock would have died from the previous plagues. Well, the hailstorms were so severe and so large that even people working in the fields were killed as a result of being hit by the hailstones. And whatever crops and plants and trees remained, all would have been stripped bare and destroyed. That leads us into chapter 10 of Exodus, where we have the 8th plague, which is a plague of locusts. Now, as a farmer, in my previous vocation, I have seen plagues of locusts wipe out crops as millions and millions of them swarmed at night, eating all before them. And the 9th plague was darkness. But this darkness was not just the absence of light. It seems to be more than that, for it was a very physical darkness that could be felt. It's not hard to imagine how this would have created terror in the minds of all who endured it. And now we come to chapter 11, when Moses warns Pharaoh in advance of the 10th plague, a plague that would take the life of every firstborn in the land, human and animal. Now, there is a spiritual significance here because Pharaoh was seen as a deity. He was a god. And as an Egyptian god, his firstborn son would claim title upon the death of his father. So this would mean that Egypt would lose their god, and the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac and Jacob would stand alone as the only one true God. You see, God made it clear to Moses why he was performing all these signs, and the way was to harden the heart of Pharaoh and his servants. And you read that in chapter 10 and verse 2, that you may tell it in the hearing of your son and of your grandson, how I have dealt harshly with the Egyptians, and what signs I have done among them, that you may know that I am the Lord. Well, for years and years, as we know, the children of Israel were taken through those stories as they read every Passover, the Exodus from Egypt. Chapter 12 gives us the Passover, and the first thing we read is that the month where the Passover took place, which actually was the 7th month in their calendar up till now, became the first month. It was a reconstructed Jewish calendar. It appears that the 7th month in the old civic calendar has now become the first month in what they called their spiritual calendar. And on the 10th day, they were to select a lamb and keep it for 4 days before killing it as their Passover lamb. Now, this would ensure that on the 14th day, the lamb they killed would be without defect, which was an illustration of the sinlessness of our Passover lamb, the Lord Jesus. Remember what Peter said? He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. Or 2 Corinthians 5 and 21, for our sakes he made him to be sin who knew no sin. Who knew no sin. Or Hebrews 4:15, one who in every aspect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. You see, all of these verses express the same truth. Christ, the Passover lamb, was perfect, was sinless. The lamb was killed at twilight, which is round late in the afternoon, 3 o'clock-ish, and its blood was collected in a basin, and with a bunch of hyssop, a common local bush, and the blood was painted on the 2 side posts and the lintel of the door of the house. They were to roast the lamb and they were to eat it within their house, but they were to be dressed, ready for departure. You find in Exodus chapter 12, verses 12 to 13, and it reveals what was going to take place. For God said, quote, "For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. And the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." You see, this was the event that would lead to their salvation. Then verse 14 sets up the annual celebration that was to commemorate this day. On the 14th day of the month, the Passover meal was to be eaten in memory of the first Passover. On the next day, the 15th day, started what was called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And that festival ran through to the 21st of the month. Now, during this time, they were not permitted to eat leavened bread, that is, bread made with yeast. The first and the last day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread were designated Sabbath days. That is, there were days that were set apart for God when no ordinary work was to be allowed. Now, here is a spiritual truth being presented, which is fulfilled with Jesus. Firstly, Jesus is our Passover lamb, slain for the sins of the world, and when we embrace his sacrifice, we are safe behind that blood that was shed on the cross. And leaven and yeast pictures what our Passover lamb has made possible for us. No longer is there guilt and condemnation for sin against us. You see, the guilt of sin has been removed, as John said in his epistle. The blood of Jesus Christ has cleansed us from all sin. That's 1 John chapter 1 verse 7. And Paul echoes that same truth in Romans chapter 8 and verse 1. There is now no condemnation awaiting those who belong to Christ Jesus. You see, we live in a condemnation-free relationship. All our leaven has been laid on Jesus at the cross. Now, all who were behind the door when the judgment took place were safe. But they were only safe because of the sacrifice of the Lamb. In chapter 12 and verse 46, it highlights another comparison to the death of Christ, where it says, "And you shall not break any of its bones," that is the Passover lamb. Now, when we look at that barbaric execution by crucifixion, breaking the leg bones of the crucified was the way they sped up that person's death. But as John chapter 20, verse 32 to 33 indicates, the two thieves had their legs broken, but when they came to Jesus, he was dead already, so they didn't break his legs. Now, it's these little details that reveal to us how Jesus crucified on the cross was the promised fulfillment of the Passover lamb that came to take away the sins of the world. So let me finish this lecture by showing you what was involved in a typical Passover feast that Jewish people to this day celebrate. And remember, it was during the Passover celebration where Jesus, with his disciples, inaugurated what we call our communion. You will see the many parallels as we celebrate this Passover feast. Well, I thought it would be interesting if we had a look at the Passover feast that Jewish families throughout the world still celebrate today. You remember in Leviticus chapter 23, it gives you the 7 feasts, and the first one is the Passover feast. And this is the feast that Jesus told his disciples to go and prepare, and out of that feast came what we call our communion service. the breaking of bread, and the drinking of the cup. And we need to remember that Jesus and the Passover fit together, because the Passover is explaining what Jesus was going to accomplish on the cross. He is our Passover lamb. When the blood was taken, put on the two side posts and on the top, and the people were inside, God promised that on that night of judgment, everywhere he saw the blood applied, the sacrifice applied, the angel of death would pass over that house. And of course, that's where the name Passover comes from. He passed over, and the judgment was not upon them to destroy them when God was smiting the land of Egypt. Well, when they came out of the land of Egypt and into the promised land, and even before that in the wilderness wanderings, they were told that they were going to celebrate this Passover every year as a memorial. And if you look on the table here, you will see what would be a Passover celebration in any Jewish home today. There are things in here that remind them of the horrors that they experienced in Egypt when they were slaves. On a typical Passover plate, which we have here, you will see that there are bitter herbs that was to remind them of the bitterness that they endured while in Egypt. You find the shank bone of a lamb that was to remind them of the Passover lamb. Then you have apples and nuts and cinnamon mixed together, and that was to remind them of the years they spent in forced labor manufacturing bricks. Then you have a little bowl that is filled with water with salt in it, and that was to remind them of the tears that they shed as they were slaves in Egypt for some hundreds and hundreds of years. And then you have a bunch of parsley, and the parsley was to be the symbol of the hyssop. You remember that Moses told them to take this bush and dip it into the bowl of blood, and to paint it on the two sides of the door and on the top. And so this became the symbol of applying that blood. And then finally, there was an egg. And like a chick breaks out of the egg when it is born, so Israel, as they came out of Egypt, so they came to new life. And that is very much what you would find on a table as people celebrated the Passover. But there are two other objects that would be on the table. The first is there would be 3 slices of unleavened bread. Now, they wouldn't be visible like this. There would be one underneath a cloth at the bottom. There would be one that would be in the middle of the cloth. And then finally, there was one at the top. They were hidden. But for hundreds and hundreds of years, as part of this ceremony, they would go in and they would take the middle bread and they would bring it out and they would break it. And remember, this is what Jesus did. He took the bread and he broke it and he said, "This is my body. Do this in remembrance of me." Now, isn't it significant that there are actually 3 slices of bread? And I believe that's a symbol of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And they always take the middle one, the Son, to break. And then you will notice that there are 4 glasses of wine. Now, some homes just have one and they use the same one 4 times. Others have 4 distinct glasses. But what it's referring to, and they have this little ceremony, they read from Exodus chapter 6. And you go down in Exodus chapter 6 and verse 6, and it says, "Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians." And so they pick up the first glass and they repeat these words, I will bring you out. And they would pass it around and partake of it and remember that they as a nation were brought out of slavery because of the Passover lamb. And they'd put it down. And then the host would pick up the second and he would read the next phrase in that verse. And I will deliver you from slavery to them. I will deliver you from slavery. And so again, they would pass it around and all in the house would repeat that phrase, I will deliver you. And then they come to the third cup, and it is known as the cup of redemption. And the next phrase is, I will redeem you with outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. And so they would pass it around and they would remember and they would say, I will redeem you. And then the final cup that is picked up, and at the end of that service or memorial, they would pick up this final cup and they would read verse 7, and I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God. And so they would pass it around, saying to each other, I will take you to be my people. But when Jesus instituted what we call the Lord's Supper, the Passover lamb in fulfillment, what we might call communion, we know that Jesus took that bread which was taken and passed around, and he said, this is the symbol of my body which is broken for you. But then he took the third cup after supper, as it says, going back to this and instituting a new basis of agreement with God and man, a new covenant. And he took the cup of redemption and he said, this is my blood which is shed for you. And we know that through this shedding of blood, he became the fulfillment of the Passover feast. For he truly has endured our bitterness. He truly was the Lamb of God. He truly knew what it was to be a slave to the sins of the world. He shed many tears, and it was his blood that was shed on the cross and applied to our lives by faith. And of course, out of that, we have the resurrection. Jesus rose on that third day from the grave. And one day, because of Christ's resurrection, we too shall rise. So every year, at the right time of the year, the Jewish nation celebrates just this part and this part, but they fail to see its true significance as fulfilled in Jesus Christ, the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. God bless you, and I trust that as we've shared this journey through the first part of Exodus, you've had a grasp of what it meant to be liberated after you've been in slavery for 400 odd years, as promised by God to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15.